So I think that's the 3, 2, 1. Let's go. And if you're a Cowboy Bebop fan, please, as you're punching the air, enjoy. Uh, just remember, we're there with you. Unless of course you liked the live action remake, then we can't be friends because that was a bad decision. But this is the Redacted Culture Cast, where we actually aren't here to talk about social or comics or whatever it is. We are here to talk about gun culture, its relationship to philosophy, how we think about the world, what do we think is right and true and good, so that as we go forward in the world, we can be confident in our ability to discern information, as well as defend our lives physically, mentally, and spiritually. That being the case, I like to have my guests introduce themselves. So go ahead.
Hey, my name is Vlad Saye. I'm the owner and founder of Terminal Armament. We make communications equipment, some software-defined radio stuff, and yeah, that's basically what I do. I'm 22 years old and having fun with life.
Yep, you're accomplished for your age, at least in my perspective. So congrats.
Yeah, there's definitely been several comments that I've gotten where a lot of people have been surprised at how young I am. Sometimes it's a bit daunting, and other times it's a little bit refreshing to realize that I guess I still have a bit of life ahead of me. I still have time to do the things I want to do.
Well, if anything, if anything, we're forced to decide one of two options. It's either you're a Gen Zer who's figured out how to manipulate social media to make you look like something you're not, or there is hope for the next generation and there's hope for the future because maybe not everybody is obsessed with the latest fads in tomfoolery. So let's just move on because that's I don't need to make this I'm from the Midwest, and so we just have to make things awkward. I think it's part of like our DNA.
Oh,
But let
fantastic!
I know, right? So if you see my face change colors, yeah, I'm Swedish. I kind of blush. It's weird. Okay, enough about me. Just so that we keep some OPSEC left in the world. So yeah, so explain what terminal armament is. Like, explain how you got there, what it is, what's your goal, what are you working on, what are the things that you're doing? Because I'm familiar, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Yeah, so basically the start of the company, I think at the current date and time, a little over a year and a half ago, and basically, it kind of stemmed from I've had a bit of a previous experience and a little bit of a background in the technology and information security side of things. Nothing really professionally, but it's always been a bit of an interest of mine, specifically kind of from my early teens, starting from things like music production and getting into programming, then information security, and the whole entire tech world, so to speak. And then after that, I think in my late teens, I was kind of introduced to the, I guess what you could call the modern firearms world, which is it's I think it's interesting how I was introduced, because I'm definitely not one of those people that grew up around guns or firearms. My parents weren't anti-gun by any means, but it was just something that we didn't have around. And at the time, I believe I had some new friends who were kind of more into the space and started taking me out shooting. And at the time, I was also working at a nylon manufacturing company that was making some equipment that we, kind of see in the tactical world. And so all of that kind of came together, and really, I ended up kind of diving headfirst into the tactical world, I guess you could say. And after that job, I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do, and I saw what seemed to be a bit of a potential intersection between the tech world, or at least some aspects of that, and then the firearms or tactical world. And I definitely didn't, at the very least, I definitely didn't realize what it could be, or probably didn't envision where the company would be now. But I saw some sort of potential for overlap, and so kind of thought to myself, oh, okay, I have some niche skills in this area, and I know a little bit about the tactical world. Maybe I can combine some of this stuff, and so started getting into radios and communications. I had a small amount of background from the tech world. I know I had messed around with software defined radios a small amount previously before I really started everything. But yeah, yeah, basically was looking for something to do, and I thought, well, hey, why not? Why not start a small business and see how everything goes? And it's the rest is kind of history, and we can definitely go more into the growth process of that later. But yeah, that's kind of the basic founding story of how everything got started.
Okay, so yeah, so there are a couple of differences already to be, I think, illuminated, but one of them is it's amazing what 10 years of difference will do, because in some ways the idea of being involved in tech in the 90s and the early 2000s was oftentimes summarized in like you built computers. And sometimes, and then there was like the rise of video games, and there was these different cultural and social effects that went into play. And and all at the same time, I think, even looking back, it's it's hard to quantify. It would have been hard for anyone. It would have been hard for a lot of us to see and say 2008, 2012, what like the changing face of technology would look like. And the idea of information security, technological, like this sort of technology related to security subject, um, sometimes strayed pretty far into sci-fi, and then sometimes seemed to be just like the IT crowd. The social perspective of that world was very strange, very different than what it is now. So yeah, like I can think, I can look back and say, well, yeah, like information security, what it looked like 15 years ago to a non-participant was something between like corporate espionage and hacking, and it didn't it like I did not grow up as much in that world. So it's interesting to see how you would make the claim that there's an intersection between the technology world and the firearms world, and I struggle to see if there's any way for them to even be separated any ever again. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would definitely say that the so to speak union of those two worlds isn't fully there. I'd say it's definitely something that is young, budding, starting out, whatever you want to call it. But I really do think that the fundamental connection there is, and of course this doesn't necessarily apply to every single firearms owner out there, right? Just like it doesn't apply to every single programmer who's out there, right? But I think the real intersection comes from people who want to pursue individual freedom, right? And in all honesty, I don't think, even when I was starting to see the intersection or the potential of that, I don't even think that I realized what that fundamental correlation was. But now I think, at least that's what I would say, is kind of driving people in these areas together. And I guess it could kind of be defined by people who are interested in digital security and privacy and freedom, and people who are interested in physical security and privacy and freedom. And I think the reason that those two, at the very least, should start to combine more is because no matter how you feel or how you think about technology, kind of like what I said in the video I posted today, unless you want to run off and live in a cabin in the woods for the rest of your life, it is something that's going to be a part of your life, our life, society as a whole, for the foreseeable future, at least, save any sort of catastrophic event. And so I think that it can be such a fantastic tool to preserve and enable individual freedom, but it also has to be balanced out with some of the aspects of physical freedom that we see in the firearms world. And so I think the two kind of go hand in hand a little bit. And I think more people are definitely going to start seeing that in the future as they start pursuing individual freedom as a whole, and not just from a, oh, I want to be financially free, so I'm going to get into cryptocurrency, for instance, right? Or, oh, I want to be able to protect my house and my family, so I'm going to get into firearms.
So you reference this idea of like going and living in a cabin in the woods, which there's a famous novel on this, or there's a famous book on the subject written by Thoreau, I believe it's called Walden, and I haven't read it yet, so that's a critical error on my part. But I struggle to see the validity of even that as a strategy. Like there is nowhere to go anymore. The proliferation of signal intelligence is so thoroughly coding the United States that unless you were to, I mean, I don't know if it's even possible. Like I don't see it as a possibility anymore.
I mean, Siberia exists, but other than that, yeah.
Okay, so you could go live somewhere that is so inhospitable that that like that even pursuing you would be absent any value. You could, but essentially you'd be going off and dying somewhere.
Yeah,
Um,
I think if you want to live anywhere where there's any potential of someone at some point wanting to come and take what you have, that's something that you basically have to consider. You can't. Your world doesn't exist in a vacuum, and I don't think it's very wise or prudent to imagine that.
exactly. Like we do not exist in a void. We're not solipsists. Where there is more to reality than just our perception. So then, when it comes to technology, um, it technology is an interesting one because I think science fiction is still a really good entrance point because it blends mysticism and technology. It blends science and fiction, and well, yeah, science and fiction or mysticism and technology in many ways. And we hear things in our like in our culture. We hear things even in our circle. Things that are like your phone is a government funded spy program or platform or whatever. And I would actually like to hear you try to explain that point because I think it gets missed a little bit in the hyperbole, or well, the not hyperbole, but just the shocking nature of the statement.
Oh, the fact that your phone is a government surveillance device.
Yes, like I think most of us are
Um,
aware of that by this point, but I would like to see it a little bit, one more piece of the puzzle added.
yeah, I mean, man, there's so many aspects you could come at it from, but I I, th- I think in some way this cell phone is basically the epitome of the battle between convenience and privacy, right? And how much are people willing to give away? And I also think that, going back to the topics of science fiction, I feel like in some ways science fiction can often quote unquote help. I'm doing air quotes right now, help normalize these things that otherwise would seem extremely dystopian. Everyone knows that their phone is at the very least capable of recording from all of its sensors and reporting back to whatever government agency or whatever device manufacturer makes it. But it's just become so normal that people don't really think about that on a day-to-day level or minute-to-minute level as they are carrying their phone around. It's just become such a part of reality that people accept it, and they know the consequences, but they don't really, I wouldn't say not even they don't care, but it has become so normalized that it's just something, well, you just need to accept that the government is going to be able to listen to you and follow you and watch you at all points of the day.
I think a close parallel that we have enough time in history to draw between us is the Industrial Revolution. Is that and specialization in that format is that like one of the things that the industrial revolution did bring is it brought free time. I've heard the industrial revolution as sort of the advent of free time, and before, and I know that this is I know a perspective, but before the ideally before or not ideally, in this description before the industrial revolution and the separation of powers, not powers, sorry, the industrial revolution and the specialization of populations, you had a very agrarian society where each person and their farm, each person had to be able to accomplish multiple tasks in addition to whatever their artisanal skill set was, including things like running the farm, keeping the family together, keeping the house together. And the industrial revolution introduced the division of labor so succinctly that what one thing that people sort of gave up was freedom for security, except for I mean, that's like, I think that's putting a lot into a single concept, but I think it can be applied in some ways to the phone. Is that I think if we just look at it purely as a device, I think we're not giving it the full spectrum of its impact on the world, and recognizing that it still has a very, very real jeopardizing factor. There's a word I'm looking for and I'm missing it again, but it has its inherent dangers, and one of those is surveillance.
Yeah, and with the, specifically, I guess you could maybe even call it the technological revolution, and right, like how you were saying, the phone not just as this kind of standalone device, but the access that it gives you, and this idea that every single individual on the planet has instantaneous access to every other individual on the planet and all of their problems, all of their thoughts, all of their emotions, yet also somehow none of those perhaps are exactly real and end up being masked in some way or another for the sake of appearances, whether that be good or bad. And so yeah, I like that's also another aspect of it that definitely has, I would say, some sort of profound impact on humanity. And in all honesty, I know I've said this a couple of times, but I genuinely don't think that we will fully realize the consequences that, we'll say, quote unquote, the internet, or maybe more specifically the instantaneous access to every other person, has had on the individual. We're probably not going to realize the full consequences of that for, I don't know, at least several more years, like the long-term effects of that. So that's definitely another aspect of having these devices in our hands.
There's been a number of books that have been written trying to assess that specific question, and some of them focus on social media, some of them focus on the internet, some of them focus on the idea of open source information. And in 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 good faith, I think that there are people who are trying to quantify or qualify the impact of these forms of technology, because now we've already listed three different products or three different things: the cell phone, which in many ways was made possible by the globalization of an economy. Then you have the internet, which was made possible by a combination of factors, including like the added benefit that it brought, and the added benefit in communication and broadcasting that it brought. And then you have social media, which is in many ways like this decentralizing platform, sort of, but now seems to be re-centralizing. And it's trying to quantify it is going to be difficult, because I think what we're going to run into is, before we're even able to start making better assessments of all of its impacts on human life, we're going to be dealing with generations maybe one or two removed from living from a world that never had it. Like I remember a time when I didn't have a cell phone, and I remember a time when we didn't really have the internet. And it's pretty distant memory for me, but that is fading. That reality is fading. And I wonder if people encountered that same thing during the Industrial Revolution, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, where the division of labor and the what is it, when people started moving from into the cities, so the rise of the metropolis, all was happening so quickly that there was like almost a sudden loss of connection to the world even before that time. I remember reading a book about uh, Rockefeller, and that is a very, like, the before wealth Rockefeller, before oil Rockefeller. It was a very different person. The world before, at the beginning of Rockefeller's life, was very, very, very different than the life that he left, essentially. And it was almost like I couldn't. Just reading that book, the world was so different. How would you explain it to anybody? And now we're sitting here with the internet and globalization and all these other things going on. It's like it's producing the exact same thing. Another shocking shift in human experience. Yet at the same time, we're finding some things never change. there will always be issues of like corruption, and there will always be influences from different areas, and people will always find ways to do new evil and whatever you want to have with that.
Yeah, and I like the ability of humans to adapt to these different changes, perhaps over maybe one generation, perhaps over other generations, and then of course the question of is that adaptation something that an individual will learn through their lifetime, or perhaps if you're born into some new environment, you will just automatically pick it up, or at some fundamental level, do humans change genetically after a while to be able to adapt to these new things? I really wouldn't know how the industrial revolution might have affected that, but this is something I have wondered about recently, specifically with the, well, once again, if we want to call it the technological revolution or the age of the internet or whatever, is in a few generations, I wonder if people will basically adapt to being able to tune out the noise of having everyone the problems of the world at their doorstep, basically. And is that something that you will adapt to, you know because you've grown up with it, or is it something that you will maybe perhaps adapt to later on in your life? I guess you could say the noise of having so much more input into your mind is, yeah, the effects that has on the human brain. I wouldn't really know.
Yeah, I'm not a Darwinist. I don't, but so I don't. I'm not a Darwinist, but I'm not a Darwinist, but oh geez, there you go. There's another bad argument. And what I mean by being a Darwinist is the sort of implied righteousness of the survival of the fittest. Like, it's weird because Darwinism did kind of produce that sort of outcome. In one way, it was presenting this argument simply of what it was saying was fact, and that the fittest survive to pass on their genes and so long and so forth. But what we kind of like neglect from elements of what came out of Darwinism was we saw new forms of um, determined artificially imposed hierarchies based on, say, like genetics, which existed before Darwin, to be sure, but like Darwin did not invent racism, but he gave them so much fuel to deal with. And so when I talk about Darwinism, I'm saying perhaps why I wanted to bring that one up is Darwinism, like it's this idea of like the survival of the fittest. Perhaps what you'll see as humankind continues to grow or continues to live on is the fittest, the next version of the fittest will be the people who are capable of tuning out the waste of information, or they'll be able to tune out
Yeah,
something. I think
right.
that's a
Yeah, yeah. Whatever that ends up being, and it's yeah. I think just the interesting question of, will it be something that happens as a result of growing up in that environment, or will it be something that perhaps at some level maybe fundamentally changes in the human brain? Of course, not to the point of something that would make us non-human, but being, I genuinely don't know, but I think that it would.
I have an optimistic proposal then, is that the next version of the survival of the fittest will be the example of the fittest will be the people most capable of evaluating information according to reality. There's a lot of culturally public ways that you could do this that wouldn't be too much of a low blow, but you think about it, is in social media has had an impact, or even just the presence of the cell phone and technology and all this information. Let's just get away from like the TikTok dancers and all that stupid stuff, but focus just on like information as ingested through the internet. You can Google yourself into believing anything. You can just keep running that search bar until you get enough answers to justify your belief within your preconceived, although probably not premeditated, but subconscious factors for determining a thing to be true. And so if you just sit there, if you want something to be true, I'm sure that if you spend, well, I'm not sure, I know you can do this. You can spend enough time on the internet and find enough quote unquote articles which validate your position. Case in point would be flat earthers. Like there's not a lot of flat earthers around there, but it's the same mentality. Is that they have started with their foregone conclusion and then essentially reorganized all the information that they consume into justifying that conclusion. But we see this in so many other ways, whether it's going to be Holocaust denial or flat earthers or different forms of like social issues like systemic racism. It's you've just started with your conclusion and you're fitting everything into your decision, your into your preconceived worldview, and so and I guess systemic racism is probably a little tricky because there is a small section of that which I think can be considered justifiably true, but most of it's just utter and complete hogwash. Um,
Yeah, and I think
and
there's a quote, I don't remember who it's by, but basically to paraphrase is all knowledge sums to zero. Basically, kind of going back to your point of being able to Google yourself into believing, or finding some sort of proof to make yourself feel confident enough that what you believe is definitely true. And yeah, like you were saying earlier, the ability to process all of that information and yet still somehow be able to find, or at the very least try to genuinely search for objective truth with all of the information pulling you in a million different directions. And I would say even that kind of, I feel like you have to, if you really want to search for truth, I think that you have to have the ability to legitimately question anything and to legitimately give a voice to even the things that might seem completely absurd. Now, of course, definitely not believing it just because, oh, some crazy person on the street has spouted that idea. But personally, I have always found it incredibly interesting when I have had the opportunity to talk to people who have maybe had ideas that normal society would consider crazy, and crazy not just in the sense of maybe some quote unquote small conspiracy theories, but crazy as in like whether you want to say flat Earth or hole in the Antarctic or whatever, right? And I feel like even that stuff, even for people for who try to search for truth, everyone has some sort of internal barrier where once you get to that, you're like, well, this it can't be real after this, right? I'll have like my circle of things that I accept as truth, and then my circle of things that I'm perhaps willing to question. But then outside of that, it's like, no, I don't want to go there. And of course, like I said previously, not to instantly give validity to anything, but kind of an example, I guess you could say, that I like to give is that if there was one individual who truly knew the secrets of the universe, whatever that might be, everyone would, without a doubt, call them insane, crazy to whatever extent. And so I do think, one, from an aspect of perhaps pursuing truth, but also from more of, let's say, a human aspect of how did this person, this human being, come to this conclusion, which I would deem to be insane, or at the very least like completely irrational or illogical, right? Like how does a person going through their life end up coming to a belief in this, and not just some sort of superficial thing that they want to spout out for the sake of getting clout or whatever, but they fundamentally believe this thing that I don't really think could be true. So I think both from a truth perspective and a human perspective, it's at the very least good to hear these things out and legitimately be willing to question them and have the conversation at the very least.
Yeah, there's a difference between understanding somebody's argument and how they got there and justifying it, or understanding how
Yeah.
a person thinks and justifying their decision making. That's an important thing that I see get missed often. It's almost dating me in the form of the culture war, but there was this time where I would hear people say things like, "Oh, I would never read that. I would never want to give them whatever it is, give them credence or the satisfaction of their information being read. And it was interesting because these were oftentimes spouted by the least intelligent but most like Dunning-Kruger people that I've known. And it's not universal. Like that's a little bit insulting, and so I should probably pull that back a little bit. But I found a tendency is that they viewed the idea of even engaging in the argument as legitimizing it, which is funny because like that's such an intellectual tactic that's used in subversive in subversive movements, like things that are intended to like gaslighting, or things that are intended to break your confidence in something, that they're really not there to argue in good faith. It's just such a bad faith argument, is just to engage in a bad faith argument with you just to legitimize my condition. And we see that happen all the time on the internet. We see that happen all the time in like the culture war. But I think I think instead of getting distracted by those things in this conversation, it's also a really good epistemological practice. Epistemology being the philosophy of knowledge and how we understand things. How do we, like, it's this, how do we know things? What is it asks questions like, what is the sufficient, what is knowledge? What does it consist of? Or what is a belief? Or what is like, what is a belief? Is it a preposition that I hold in my mind to be true? So like it's just essentially a preposition is a sentence, or we think of prepositions in sentences, but like a preposition is any sort of truth statement. Like this can is red. I can say that in 7 different languages. It's the same proposition or preposition. This is going into prepositional logic, but so like is knowledge simply like holding the sentence in whatever way, whether it's a literate or an illiterate sentence in my noggin that says this can is red? Is that knowledge, or is that a belief? And so I know it sometimes, like in the study of epistem, or in like rigorous philosophical study, epistemology can become kind of the redheaded stepchild uh, of the practices or disciplines of philosophy, because it can kind of be a little, it can very quickly be abused by disingenuous actors to try to get you to essentially doubt everything. But there is grounds to be found there, and it'll be interesting to see how, in my hope, I guess perhaps my investment is false, but my hope is that people will begin looking at classical philosophy again, like years and years and years of literature, because that is the only place that I've found ways to like sort through all the garbage. Is that there's thousands of years of human history where people have engaged in like ideas and what makes an idea justified, and how did we come to this conclusion, and whether or not it's a reasonable conclusion, or whether or not it's an irrational idea. And so like, and all of these things have been like, it's not that there's nothing new under the sun alone. It's that there is more to this world than the technology and the information that's being presented. Like, this is not the first time we've been lied to, or this is not the first time that we've had to engage with dishonest actors, or sophists for that matter. But there are tools for evaluating this kind of information, and I'd like to be able to continue to try to present some of them. So
Yeah, and the right, those deep philosophical questions. I'll preface this with saying I'm by no means a philosopher. I find it interesting, and I'm trying to read a little bit more about it. I have oh, what's the book? It's The Story of Philosophy by, oh man, I don't remember the guy's name. But anyways, I think it's a fairly popular book as far as that goes. I have it sitting on my nightstand. I've slowly been going through it. But right, like you were saying, those, so to speak, deep ancient questions that plenty of humans have asked before, and plenty of humans will ask again. And at least for me personally, I found that there is, to be able to go through day-to-day life, there is an absolute need for layers of obscurity in your logic and thought, right? You have to have some sort of fundamental reasoning, but it becomes extremely, not just mentally tiresome, but I think just inefficient, and eventually maybe foolish to think of about everything on a day-to-day basis from a first principles perspective. But I think for some things, you do have to do that and kind of start from, you know from the very basics, from what I can experience. What is some sort of building block that I can lay on top of that seems to make sense, and then on top of that, I can lay other stuff, and and at the same time to be willing to let go of those fundamental blocks as well if something does come along that questions them, and that I think that's a perhaps an interesting rabbit trail, but in the discussion of how religion and a belief in God, and I'll say those as like two separate things, can influence the way that people think and influence the questions that people may or may not be willing to ask about their most fundamental beliefs, I guess I would say.
Or it's exactly how they answer those fundamental beliefs. Like that's like if it's being able to answer the question isn't the same as refusing to be able to ask the question. So as far as like a religious belief, I will disagree with you pretty strongly on this one, is that I all people are fundamentally religious creatures. There's no way around it.
Oh, I would agree. I would agree.
But there like there so having a what we would understand as like a codified religion, or some sort of religion that's organized in such a way that it's not just pure chaos, is a way of answering those fundamental questions. They've already gone so far as to answer them. Now, sometimes those answers are come to through disingenuous means. Sometimes they're extremely naive, absolutely, but they have those answers there. And naivety will only suffice, what's the word? It'll only provide enough information and material for that person to survive off for so long. It's only, you can't, like, a naive belief only survives for so long, and then it oftentimes comes crashing down in a catastrophic event when it's been held on long past its expiration date. It doesn't mean that the person doesn't come to the same conclusion that X is true or Y is false at the end of it, but their understanding and belief in that thing is so much more solid. They just had to go through some purging and reorganizing of what they believed to come back to that same original belief. You could think of it this way. I mean, there's a couple ways that could be presented, but it's a good one. It's a really good one when it comes to thinking about how we believe, because just because a person believes something like the world was created in 6 days by God doesn't mean that they're not willing to question that. They may have just come to that conclusion through their own through a series of arguments, or they just might believe it because they were told to. However, it's a pretty ugly fallacy to assume that everyone who believes a certain thing only believes it because they were told to. That's kind of a naive, small brain thought.
I would, yeah, no, I would definitely. I'm not saying that people just believe things because they were told to, but at least, and I'll just say this from personal experience in, I guess what you would classify as like traditional Christianity. From my personal experience, I've found that oftentimes if you want to ask like truly fundamental questions, right? If you are, stripping back well, let's just call it the building block of whatever your religion is, then you're stripping back whatever your belief about perhaps the Bible or the Word of God is, and you're stripping back your belief about perhaps what even the idea of God is, and then you're just trying to ask questions from that fundamental perspective without all this the pieces of God and the Bible and religion on top of that. At least personally, I feel like there are some times where a lot of Christians will view that as, I guess I would say, almost blasphemous, right? To take away the worldview of Christianity and of God, and to question things like that. Once again, I'm not saying that every individual is not willing to ask those questions, but I think at least from my personal experience and just talking to a variety of people, and even perhaps even when you're posing the question to someone, if you're posing a question of, let's say, some sort of fundamental reality that you're trying to figure out, completely from first principles, right? Like, just what am I experiencing, right? My five senses. At least in my conversations with a lot of Christians, it can be difficult for them to actually put aside their beliefs, and they'll say, "Oh well, no, I know this to be true, so why would I question it, so to speak, right?
Yeah, that's it. I get the point. I think I do, because it is. It comes across as, so if you're going to challenge them to assume what they believe to be true to not be a preconceived notion, the defense is like, well, that's what I believe. So how would I supposed to assume that it's not true, or assume some sort of deeper foundation? Like, this is the deepest foundation. It doesn't mean that it is actually deeper. I guess that's probably a caveat that I have to put in there. I can understand the difficulty that many Christians we might deal with in saying, well, assume that maybe, well, let's see, your preconceived notions about God are not established. And it's like, okay, well, it's a thought project. I think in an honest conversation you can engage in something like that. um but like, I think the retort and the proper response is, the method by which you come to the conclusion that you assume that it is not true is no different than the method or conclusion that you assume that it is true. And so what we're basically doing is we're starting from the assumption of first principles, not the establishment of them. First principles don't really have to do with senses. They have to do with something even more foundational of, like, what is reality. That would
Hmm.
be closer to first principles. Now, what you're engaging with is referred to as like the Descartesian task, or Descartes, which is where we get the term incognito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. Which is actually a pretty short document to read, and it's a really good one to read. It's a little frustrating, but I think it's Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes, and I think that's the title. I know it's by Descartes, but he basically, this is where we get some of the idea of like what the movie The Matrix is about. Of, how do I know that this is reality? Maybe I'm just that, like, literally all of my senses are being lied to. How do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat being told, all of this information by some sort of controlling demon or whatever? And so that one does address first principles, and it's a good thought practice. But you would. So now that we're resuming from the elevator music, because interruptions happen, I tend to throw it in just because it works. But yeah, so in resuming where we were at, from the brief interruption, I think it's Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes, where he engages in, I think that's the title. It might be changes because he wrote it in a different language. But that's an important example of it, of engaging in sort of the primal question of what is reality. But that's just because we can try to go in that conversation. It is a difficult one for people to engage with, regardless of your background. I think some of the reasons why people would be hesitant to assume their moral foundations are not already pre-built into the world is because, on a base level, the assumption that it's true isn't is it, if we're going to assume that it's true, it's not true. Why is that any different than assuming that it is true? It's not a very good, strong argument from the beginning. But it's a good challenge. It's a really good thought experiment. Like, why? How did this come to pass? But let's move on a little bit. Let's step out of the world of philosophy, because we're going to come back into it in the second half. I have a question written down here for you, and given what you've been doing for the last couple of years, and what we're looking at in our world today, if you were to want to add one skill set to what we would refer to as like the citizen, or one skill set that I think that a citizen should pursue, because so much of gun culture has evolved um, away from like a fashion hobby thing to more of like plate carriers and night vision and so on and so forth. If you were to add one skill set, or you'd recommend one skill set for those looking to add one more to their toolbox, what would it be?
Hmm. That is a
Especially
it's
especially in tech related.
yeah. I mean, there's definitely a few that I could think of off the bat. One that I will say, just kind of from like a even a more fundamental perspective, is just medical knowledge. If you're wanting to be someone who it has the capacity and ability to help people, or if that's something that you're wanting to do, you should probably well have the knowledge and training and equipment to actually be able to help people in the most likely scenarios. Um, but there are a lot of people who, at least in this space, have already explored that. As far as from a technology perspective, I don't know that I could necessarily pick out a particular skill set, other than just the broad term of quote unquote technology, right? Um, because there's so many things that you can get into. I mean, I would honestly say that we're definitely, if we haven't already started seeing this, we will definitely see it in the future, that even programming will become, I don't know how you want to say it, perhaps at least parts of it. Well, then again, this is kind of the question of what what parts of jobs is artificial intelligence going to take over. There was definitely a talk, at least before some of the more recent stuff came out, that programming is becoming and would become more of a blue collar job than it at least was previously. Um,
I
but
think you can.
I would
I I think you can easily argue that it will. I don't. I like
yeah.
the. I don't. Let me be clear. The tech boom. This is just. This is not. For those who are already integrated in tech. Um, Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the boom that came from the tech, like that created Silicon Valley and created all of these different programs. Um, we don't know how long it will go, but if there isn't a new thing, it's going to continue to become more blue collar because more and more people are entering that workforce. And so many people, even from like millennials, so many millennials got into tech where they were coding, and there's the famous, like the kind of caricatured story of the kid living in a 4 by 6 foot box because all he does is code, and he's living in California. That might have been more relevant 5 to 7 years ago, but now I think it might be changing. Um, but yeah, it's not going to hold that form of supremacy forever.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, so I think if there'd be one skill set, right, I guess it would be to, at the very least, try to become more comfortable with technology, not just in the sense of, you know, being quote unquote tech savvy, so to speak, but really start thinking about how is technology going to affect my life and also my freedoms and my privacy. Because it is definitely, and this is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, the overlap between tech and firearms. You know, it's technology is definitely one of the ways that a lot of our freedoms are being infringed upon. And if we do claim to be advocates, not just advocates of personal and individual freedom, but truly trying to, I guess you could say, fight the good fight and preserve those freedoms, we can't just ignore an entire sector where said freedoms and said privacy is being attacked. So if I could try to narrow it down to a skill set, I guess it might be that.
How would you recommend somebody who's already involved in gun culture to start adding a technological advantage or integration into what they're already doing? Whether it's through radios or signal intelligence or air gapping or trying to figure out some sort of infosec for themselves. I think that is I think I think a lot of us have done the American people a great disservice by not integrating that deeper into our culture.
Yeah, and as far as like from just a firearms perspective, I think a good way, if you want to, let's say, start your tech journey from that space, yeah, I think radios is a fairly good place to start because it fits in to the gun culture, the tactical world, all of that stuff, and it's definitely something that has an infinite amount of depth. You can do something from as simple as having a really basic radio to talk to your buddies when you're on the range, to getting into really advanced electronic warfare and that whole area of things. So there really is no limit to how far you want to take that. And it might be something that people are a little bit more comfortable dipping their toe into, and perhaps even it might be the motivation that people need to start getting into that, because that can definitely be one of the limiting factors of people trying to explore and find something new. Is they just like, well, I don't know, why should I, so to speak. And in the gun world, we hear so many times move, shoot, communicate. So why not start exploring the communicate side of that?
Yeah, I'm no longer. I think in some ways the why and the how. Well, no, let's separate the why and the how real quick. Let's do that. The why, as in why would you want to become more literate when it comes to the proliferation of technology and surveillance systems in your life? Well, when you phrase it that way, it seems pretty convincing alone for most. One of the challenges that we deal with the idea of surveillance, though, is that the only thing that you can kind of do is get away from it is the only goal, instead of like stopping it, if that makes sense. One of the challenges with let's just say surveillance is that there is I think we're kind of cutting over an edge. We're crossing over a mountain right now. We're going from one milieu, not one paradigm, into another paradigm when it comes to how we approach information and intelligence and security in regards to personal security and information. Sorry about that. But it's
You're good.
no, so like the why is pretty straightforward. Is that a war, like it's not that just a war is being fought against you, is not the right way of saying it, because that's way too like it just doesn't work. I'm sorry, that is not a very good argument for long term for like long term um fuel. Like we've talked about this a number of times. Like this hoping in the apocalypse is a really bad form of motivation. If you think of motivation like fuel, think of that as like really cheap hot burning fuel. It's going to be great for like a day or 2 days, or when a couple of days, and then it's going to burn out and you're going to be just out. Whereas a good fuel source for motivation is something that provides motivation day after day after day after day, and it doesn't change in the rain or the sun or the snow, or the the whether it's a red president or a blue president or an orange president or whatever. Like a good source of motivation is consistent over time. And I have fallen prey to the cheaper forms of of motivation in the past. And part of this project is to continuously counter that narrative, because it's extremely compelling and self-destructive. And so when this comes to the why of why would I want to get integrated with technology, is because I want to have better integration to my people without there being more surveillance. Now the how is an entirely different question. If you're not communicating with somebody, you're not communicating at all. So let's start with the communications method. Like let's do communications, surveillance, and then moving forward.
Um, yeah, well, and just to really quickly talk about some of those points that you made, I absolutely agree that the the motivations that are behind your reason to get into something are incredibly important. And with not just technology, not just with firearms, and not just even with the integration of that and the large overall pursuit of individual freedom, I think something that is oftentimes lacking is a basically a legitimate hope being a legitimate and well-founded hope being brought to people that sure, there's probably going to be some sort of bad time in the future, right? Like historically speaking, we can look at that, something in some way or some shape, at what scale we don't know, negative is going to happen. But overall, for humanity, for life on this earth, there is a genuine hope. And I do think, and I would agree with you there, that is one of the not just most important aspects to view things from, but I think as, let's say, whether we want to call ourselves content creators or public figures or influencers at whatever scale, if you have a voice and you're reaching other people, I think individuals who provide hope at scale to other people are that's I think that's one of the most valuable things that you can do for humanity as a whole. And I would say, like, specifically with technology, right? If we want to just talk about the overall motivation, I think that technology has the potential to improve people's freedom, their independence, and their privacy, rather than what we see now is take it away. I truly do think that there's that potential to completely flip the odds and, not just increase our quality of life, whatever you might define that as, and not just increase the convenience of mundane tasks, but to truly make the individual more free at a fundamental level on a global and, civilizational scale, I guess, if you want to say that.
So you're refusing the requirement, the assumed requirement that in order to gain the benefits of the internet, you must subject yourself to its surveillance. You're saying that you can there is something that you think technology can be led, guided, or developed or decentralized in such a way where you can have the benefits of it without the benefits of it without the surveillance, surveillance, so to speak.
I'm basically betting everything on it.
Let's do it. So how like okay, so how do you think that could be accomplished? Like what explain it. Explain this idea. Explain it a little bit more cuz now I'm very curious. And you got like 5 minutes, maybe 7. Let's try.
All right. First of all, I'd say that, like, right, technology as a whole is extremely broad and multifaceted. There's a plethora of ways, whether that be finance or communication or transportation, whatever. But let's just say, just to narrow down on the one thing, at least the one thing that I'm focusing on right now, which might be communication. And this would also go to uh, another kind of idea that I have, and I'm trying to work through a little bit, is the fact that not the fact, but just the idea that perhaps the best way to pursue freedom is not to try to take away the power of things that might try to encroach on freedom, but to build systems and um, infrastructure, let's just say, that by default gives the option of freedom and independence to the individual. So I'd say, at least from my perspective, that's kind of the way I like to pursue it. But, if we're talking about maybe from a more practical perspective, let's talk about um, well, I don't know that that might be a little bit more than a 5-minute tangent on, potential ways that the internet and the communications infrastructure as a whole could be decentralized and still sustainable and provide a better option. Which we can go into that if you'd like.
I would. I want to hear, like cuz we're going to break here in a little bit and we're going to finish the first part 1, and what I want to do is I want to start tapping into that. Like I want to start tapping into this idea of the decentralization of technology, and if we have to recover a little bit of it when we resume for the next part of this show, this is something that I find still very interesting, is maybe even your aspiration for this idea of decentralized technology. If you were to try to describe that to somebody like me, this idea of decentralized technology, how would you describe it? Because my experience with technology has been very centralized. Maybe I know different forms of it, but no assumptions made. How do you see the decentralization of technology proliferating for the human population? How would we even get invested into something like this? Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it both? Is it neither?
So I think from a fundamental aspect, if we're talking about decentralization, the um, a good place to start is basically what is what is the value that we are trying to provide with this certain thing, or rather, let's just say, what is the value that is provided, right? So in terms of, let's say, communication, right, from one device to another, the value there is obviously, data being transferred. But as far as, let's say, communications infrastructure, the value that the communications infrastructure provides is, it's not data going from one node to another node, it's data passing through a node. Let's just say that that is the value that the cell tower provides. That is the value, that internet infrastructure as a whole provides, right? Because if I want to Bluetooth a picture from my phone to yours and we're in the same room, it's basically of no cost to either of us. We're both, like, let's say, consenting parties in that transaction. I say, hey, I have a picture, I'm going to send it to you. We both use a small amount of computing power, and a small amount of actual like electricity and power, and and other things like the frequency spectrum and sending things wirely, but that's another discussion, right? But we're both using resources that we have. But if you are in the next town over from me and I want to send some information to you, and I can't get it to you just from my device directly to your device, then there has to be some sort of third party in the middle there, or a variety of third parties. And the data passing through that third party is really the value that is provided. So I think, once again, from a fundamental aspect, the value that when you pay for your internet service provider, when you pay for your cell phone service provider, you're basically paying for them to put up a cell tower in your area or run infrastructure in your area, and you are giving them X amount, $35, $50, $100 a month, to be able to take your information, pass it through that node, and transfer it to the end destination. So if we're thinking about, okay, how can we decentralize it, the question that basically, or not the question, but the problem to be solved is, how can we directly tie the value of data passing through a node to an actual, like, let's say, currency, or some sort of exchange of value, to where then that infrastructure can be, perhaps, let's say, set up by any individual, and you do not have to pay a service provider to set up a wide net of infrastructure. You are only basically paying the owner of the node that your information is going through, if that kind of makes any sense from a large picture decentralization aspect. That's kind of the problem to solve, I would say.
Yeah, it does, because the challenge that you're dealing with is essentially, we could also think of them as like relays. But the node,
Yeah.
right, is how would you distribute nodes? I've seen some stuff about this. I've seen some. This is where I get to stand and stand in the brink of chaos and be like, I've seen people try to present solutions, and some of them seem pretty solid. But now I think what we're doing is, oddly enough, let me put it this way. I wonder if gun culture is going to be the community, the subgroup of Americans who institute a essentially private, not a private, but a decentralized communication network across the country. Right? So like, think of it like a like a mesh network across the country. It's
Yeah.
not run by it's not
And
run by
it
Go ahead.
Yeah, oh yeah, I was just going to say, definitely it definitely could be, and I think there's a potential for that. The big issue, and this is something that is a question that I'm actively trying to answer for myself, just in the pursuit of this in the future, is, well, there is basically a leap that you have to take from, even, like, let's say, a large niche. Let's say it's the entire quote unquote gun community setting up some sort of decentralized intranet, because they value privacy and security over the convenience of the internet. But there's a massive jump that you have to take from a small niche, or even a large niche, like, commercial, to getting that technology in the hands of literally everyone. And that jump from small community to global scale, or even a technology that could be implemented at a global scale. And so that, we kind of, I talked about the first problem to solve is, how do you get that kind of financial transaction to be from the owner of the data, basically directly paying the owner of a node that the data is passing through. But the second challenge to solve is it has to be convenient, and it has to be at least as good as the current internet is, while at the same time providing, if privacy and security. Because the truth is that the majority of people will never value privacy and security over convenience. And I think for basically everything, I think that that is the unfortunate truth. And we've seen that, I believe, in a lot of social networking platforms that have tried to basically market themselves as, oh, we are a free speech platform. And that was their one marketing tool. And they came out there was a bunch of people that joined it that were all about free speech. And then basically all of them ended up leaving because, sure, while it might allow free speech, it's basically just a shittier Twitter. That's all that it was, right? And so you have to build something that is good from a fundamental level of the value it provides, being, convenience or whatever, let's just say. And then it has to actually integrate, you know, privacy and freedom and all that stuff on top of that. So that's kind of the second problem.
So we're gonna end on this. We're gonna end on this thought then, and this will be the cliffhanger. Sorry to disappoint. Sorry to disappoint you, but there is this idea that you could create a second version of Twitter and it would just grow. And there's this like the issue with Twitter being, like this, we're a new free speech platform, and that's a whole conversation itself. I think that's an interesting metaphorical parallel to creating a different version of like Verizon or AT&T or the phone network organization, because essentially you're applying the same problem and model to both options. And I wonder if there's a third option, a third solution, because I'll challenge your idea of people will always choose convenience over privacy. Yes, we have seen a consistency of that until that privacy starts costing them too much.
I would agree with that.
Because here's the thing too, is that like you can have your privacy and not be able to pay for your house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is an entirely new can of worms. So for part one, let's close up part one here and let's close up part one, because I think this is a good place to stop. Where do people find you? How do they find you on social media?
You can find me,
or wherever's the best place to do it.
Yeah, you can find me personally. I have an account on Instagram and Twitter. It's just my name, Vlad Saye, VLAD SAYE. Business account is also there. It's just Terminal Armament. Terminal Armament. You can type it into the search bar. We have a YouTube channel. Don't post too much stuff there at the current moment, but are looking to get into that more. Links to the website is in the bio of all the social media platforms. So, yeah, best way to find me. And also, I would say if you are looking for a place to kind of interact with some, more like-minded people, let's say, an option that I've personally found that's great is Grayman Network. They're on Instagram, but you can also just go to their website, grayman.network. I'm not sponsored or affiliated by them or anything, but it is what's called a matrix server. For those of you who don't know, it's basically like Discord, except for they actually own all of the physical hardware that it runs on. He writes all of his own software that, goes on top of that. So it's basically just like a private and free Discord server. My company is on there. We have a little room there. There's a bunch of other people, I believe. T-Rex Arms is on there. There's a few people that are on there frequently. JK Armament, Redbeard Tactical is on there. And so, yeah, if you're looking for a bit of a better place, maybe an alternative to Discord, they've had a fantastic platform, and I've had a great experience with them.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much. Let's get ready and get set up for then part two, which will be airing, well, if you're listening, possibly tomorrow. So with that being said, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast with Vlad Saye of Terminal Armament. If you want to support the show, we've got our pre-order going on right now for our subdued shirts, but we're not going to spend too much time plugging that. Let's get right into living our life and making it better. Geez, that's such a bad way of saying it. Midwestern problems. All right, talk to you guys soon.